Hello, the purpose of the following video is to show you how to generate a histogram in Excel. Now we typically generate a histogram when we have continuous data or a continuous variable, and we want to present the graph either in a conference or at a meeting, or maybe want to publish it in a magazine or a journal article. Now the purpose of the graph matters to which graph we end up generating. So again, if the goal is to present in some fashion, whether it's publishing or in person, then we're going to want to use a histogram. Now make sure you have your Excel spreadsheet open and the directions in the Word document available so you can follow along and replicate what I do. You of course are welcome to pause the video at any time, go back, whatever you need to do to help you in completing the activity. Now the first step that we always do when we open a spreadsheet in Excel is to check the code book and make sure we understand how the variable was collected and how it is being measured. So if you're looking at your data set here, you'll notice that we have the label of coffee. And if you hover over that label, you'll see a dollar sign telling us the cost or the amount of money spent on coffee. If you go down to your code book, you'll see in there that the question that was asked of our participants is, on average, how much do you spend on coffee per week? And so just note that when you hover over the label itself, it's not going to give you the exact question that was asked, but you can find that in the code book. All right, so the second thing that you want to do is you want to sort your data to push any empty cells or blank cells to the bottom of the spreadsheet. So we know how to do this already. We've seen it several times, but we just need to highlight our column, go to our sort and filter icon, and sort. And of course, just remember to make sure that you expand the selection. So now we can scroll down and see if there's any empty cells. It looks like there was one. Participant ID number 70 did not give a response to this particular item, but we push that data down to the bottom here so that we can isolate it and work with the variables that are above it, or the observations that are above it that do have values. Now the steps for a histogram will be similar to what you did for the frequency tables, but there are a few differences. Obviously at the end we'll turn the table into a graph, but the first difference is being that we start a new pivot table when generating a graph. So don't use the frequency table with percents as one of the columns. So remember before, when you created your tables, you had 3 columns. We don't want 3 columns here, we only want 2. So you have to start with a new pivot table. So I'll start with a new table. Even if you've done a group frequency table with the same variables, when you go to the graph, make sure that you start a new pivot table. All right, so let's take a look at our directions here. Of course, we want to create a histogram. We've already done step 1, right? We want to open Excel, make sure we understand what the variable is and how it was measured. Step 2 is we're going to create that pivot table, right? Just like we did before. So we're going to go Insert, Pivot Table. We want to make sure that we're going to put it in our existing worksheet. We do want to indicate where to put it, and as always, give yourself a few columns just in case at some point you need to do any types of transforms or calculations with your data. So we'll click OK, and then our pivot table field shows up on the right-hand side, just as it did in our previous videos. Now you notice here that we do have 2 variables here, and that's because it doesn't look like I select just one column. I might have accidentally selected both columns. That's okay, because the variable we want is still here, and we can still work from this data set that we have. So that was step 1. Step 2. Let's go to step 3. So on the right side of your screen, we have our pivot table field list. We want to make sure we click the box in front of the variable that we're interested in. We're interested in the coffee variable, so I'll go ahead and click on that one. You notice here that we don't have that variable in the rows column, so we need to go ahead and drag it down there as well. Now it did show up as a default in the sum of values box, so we don't need to drag it into that one. It was already in there as a default. So all we had to do is drop it in the rows box. So now we have 2 columns of data, right? So we're moving on to step 4. So we're going to right click the title of the second column. We want to make sure that this is counts and not sums. And so right now it's the sum of coffee, which is not what we want. We want the count of coffee. So we'll go down, we'll right click on the label, we'll go down to summarize values by, and we'll change it from sum to count. All right, and so now we have each value. We see the count for each of the values in the data set. We do need to relabel Again, this is under step 4, relabel each of these columns. So here we're going to put our midpoints. We'll calculate those later. And then this is still going to be frequency. All right, so you'll notice here that we have more data points than 10, and so we're going to have to group these data together, right? Because again, we don't want any more than 7 or 10 intervals. And we don't want any more than 7 or 10 points on the x-axis when it comes to our graph. So we're still going to need to group our variable here. All right, and you're going to see that highlighted in your directions here. Group the variable only when it is a grouped frequency chart, not a standard frequency chart. So again, this is not standard because we have more than 10 values in our data set here. We have quite a wide range, and so we're going to be grouping these data together. So just like we did with the tables, right? We're going to right-click under that very first cell underneath the label there. We want to go ahead and group. Now we're not going to mess with the starting value or the ending value, right? But we do need to know the interval width. And that interval width is the by field in this dialog box. So if you're looking at your directions, right, to get that interval width, we need to get a full range and divide by the number of intervals. So remember, the full range is the maximum value minus the minimum value plus something. Again, that something is usually 1. I think 1 would work just fine here. We're going to divide by the number of intervals. So we can choose between 7 and 10 intervals here. Let's go ahead and just choose our 7 intervals, just like we did in our last example. And so if that's the case, we would take our 76 value minus 0, which would give us 76. We'll add 1, which would give us 77, and then divide by the number of intervals that we want. So if we want 7 intervals, we'll take 77 and divide by 7. And that's going to give us an interval width of 11. So just note all these steps that we've already gone through is pretty much the same as it was with the frequency tables, with the exception is that we only have 2 columns in our table instead of 3 columns. Okay, so go ahead and click OK here. All right, and then we'll see our groupings of our variables. Now remember that in the grouped frequency table that we took that second value in each of these intervals and we made it just slightly less than the beginning of the next interval. We actually don't need to do that here, mainly because we're going to replace those intervals with midpoints anyway. And so we don't need to make that particular correction. But there are the other corrections that we still need to make to this particular table. There are some missing intervals. We do need to make sure we put zeros where they belong, where there's missing data. And so we need to make sure that we do those aspects of our table before moving on. So if you're looking at your directions, you're going to see that it says intervals with frequency counts of 0 will not automatically be shown. So we're always going to do this, right, even if we don't have any missing intervals, mainly because it gives us an extra row that may be useful to us if we're creating a frequency polygon. And so we'll talk about that in another video when we talk about the frequency polygon. But just be in the habit of going ahead and checking for this, even if there are no missing intervals there. Okay, so to find those missing intervals, we're going to right-click on that first cell under our label. We're going to go down to Field Settings. We'll go to Layout and Print. And just like before, we'll look for our option that says Show Items with No Data. And we'll go ahead and check that box. We'll click OK, and then now we're going to go ahead and get that missing row, that missing interval that we had. Notice it's going to add this additional row at the bottom. And again, that may be useful when doing a frequency polygon if you have population data, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, so if you're looking at that, you'll notice we have some blank cells there, but they should be reading 0, right? There's 0 values between 55 and 65.99, right? And so we want to make sure that we get those zeros in there instead of leaving them blank. So we'll do the same thing. We'll right-click in one of our cells, and we're going to go down to Pivot Table Options now. Notice we'll go to the Layout and Format, which happens to be the default on mine. It's probably the default on yours too, but just double check. And we're going to go down to the option where it says For Empty Cells, Show. And we want to put a 0 there because we want all the empty cells to show a 0 value. We'll click OK, and now the 0 shows up in our table. Okay, so we are doing a histogram here, so we do not need to do anything for us connecting to the x-axis or anything like that. So we can go ahead and hide the two beginning and ending rows in our table. So remember, we're going to right click, we'll go to filter, we'll hit hide selected items, and we'll go ahead and hide that particular row. Same thing with that last row, right click, filter, hide selected items. All right, and so the very next thing, if you're looking at your directions, is that we need to come up with some midpoints. Now the midpoints can be tricky for some students, so just make sure that you're paying attention here. But it doesn't have to be. I think it can be pretty straightforward. So really what we're looking for with the midpoints is the middle value of any of these particular intervals. You notice that there is a formula down there. I think the formula is probably more complicated than it needs to be. So I'll just tell you simply what it is. Generally what it is, it's going to be the lower bound of the interval that you want to get a midpoint for. So for this first interval, that lower bound is 0. And that's the lower bound of the next interval. So in our formula, that's the LI, the interval you're interested in, lower bound of the interval you're interested in, plus the interval of the next, the lower bound of the next interval, which is LI plus 1. So again, I don't think you necessarily need to know the notation there, but just notice it's just saying the lower bound of the interval you want to get a midpoint for, plus the next lower bound in your chart, and you divide by 2. So 0 plus 11 is 11, divide by 2, and we get a midpoint of 5.5. Now I'm going to put that a couple of columns away from our table here because Excel can do some automatic calculating for us once we get those first two intervals. So from here, there's a couple things that you can do. You can do the same thing for that next interval, take 11, add it to 22, and divide by 2. So it'd be 33 divided by 2, and that would give us 16.5. But if you know your interval width already is 11, remember we put it in to that dialog box before we created the table. Remember it was the by field in that dialog box. If you know your interval width is 11, then you can just add that to your very first midpoint. So 5.5 plus 11 is 16.5. So you can do it either way. Go with the one that's easiest for you. However, once you have two of your midpoints, you can highlight them and let Excel do the rest. So in this case, we'll highlight these two. I'm going to hover over that bottom right-hand corner. So notice it goes from like a plus sign to that crosshairs. Right, you don't want the one with the arrows. We want the one without the arrows. And you're just going to left-click, hold, and drag it down. And then you're going to notice that Excel is going to automatically add 11 as you drag it down. And so now you have all your midpoints for your table. Now you can't just copy and paste them in. That would be too easy. So you do have to type them in. So if you just click on the cell and then just type over the intervals, so just putting your midpoints over the intervals, then you can replace them. And that's it. Those are all your midpoints for each of your particular intervals. All right, so let's go down to step number 5. So step 5 is that we're going to click the first line of the table. Right, you will see the pivot table tools. Sometimes this is called analysis. And the overhead tab at the very top of the screen. Now we're going to go to our pivot chart. We're going to select the column, and then we're going to select clustered columns. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's click on our table here. At the top, you see Pivot Table Analyze. And so we're going to click on that. And then we're going to go to the pivot chart, which is over here to the right. We'll click on Pivot Chart. And notice that it gives us a bunch of options here. The one that we want is the column or the clustered column, which is the very first one that we have already highlighted. So columns, and then we want clustered columns, and we're going to click OK. Now we're almost there. So if you're looking at step number 6, you're going to see that this isn't quite a histogram yet. Our bars are not touching. Remember, they need to touch. We don't have labels on the X and Y axes. We have this chart junk in here, these lines and this legend. We want to get rid of those. And so we can do that if you look at step number 6, is by going to the design and going to quick layout and then selecting our option that has the labels and then also puts the bars next to each other. So up here at the very top again, right, in our chart, we have this design tab. We'll click on the design tab. And over to the left, the second icon, you see this quick layout icon. We're going to go ahead and click on that. Notice that it gives us a bunch of options here, right? The one that we want is option number 8. And again, if you hover over it, you'll see a preview of what it's going to look like. And so here we have titles for both of our axes. We have a title for the overall graph. And then, of course, our bars are now touching each other. So let's go ahead and click that layout number 8. Right, and now it's looking more like a histogram. All right, of course, now we want to make sure that we label our axes and we give it a title. We do want to make sure we double check a few things as well. We want to make sure that our midpoints are being represented. All right, again, this is in your directions here. Make sure there's no gaps between each bar, which there's not. We need to make sure that we give it a title. So the two things that we haven't done here is we haven't given a label and we haven't given a title. So we probably need to do that next. So our x-axis here represents our variable. So remember, that's our spending on coffee. So midpoints of dollars spent on coffee. The y-axis title is always going to be frequency. Right? So frequency is just a count. So how many times did people select the dollar amount with a midpoint of 5.5? Now our title should represent both axes. So our y-axis is frequency. Our x-axis here is dollars spent on coffee. So we need to include those in our title. And it should also include the population. So in this case, if we're interested in just college students, then we can add that to the title as well. So we can say frequency of dollars spent on coffee by college students. And now our title includes all three things that we need, representing both axes, and then also the population that we are representing with our particular graph. So even if you have sample data, you're still going to put in the population, who or what is being measured, because we're always inferring back to that population whenever we have sample data. Okay, so that is it. That is a histogram in Excel. And so in the next video, I'll show you how to do a frequency polygon in Excel.